you're creating suspense essentially, but instead of doing it visually, it's more auditory.
Like, I'm not saying necessarily what's the purpose of art, but I guess there is a human element to art.
Sort of thing. Just always stay in control of your own story.
Welcome, everybody, to the Beyond the Decks podcast, your guide to mastering the art and business of the DJing, electronic, and dance music industry. I'm your host, Robert Simos, here with learningtodj.com. And today we are blessed once again to be speaking to another industry pro, artist, and pioneer, really, in his own kind of sound. His name is Homemade Weapons, real name Andre Delgado, and he's been debuting since around 2012. Originally hailing from Baltimore in the United States, now based in Seattle. Accelerate, the music magazine, has described his sound as volatile and fierce, stripped back to key elements that make dance floors move. Some describe his sound as obsidian drum and bass, sci-fi 170, doom and bass, or more popularly as the samurai sound, given that he worked very closely with this group for some time. He has had a string of releases on well-respected labels like Samurai Music, Dispatch Recordings, his own imprint entitled Weaponry, which he has since sunset, in preparing to launch his own new label coming in 2025, which we are hopefully going to be able to discuss. His first release was entitled Tantrum/Copperhead on Onset Audio in 2011, with his first major album release entitled Negative Space in 2016, which was released to a very wide popular reception. So in this episode, we are going to be talking to Andre about himself, his origin, and his sound, as well as where he sees himself going in the next couple of years in the circuit of drum and bass. So Andre, with that being said, I am super excited to be speaking to you. Welcome to the podcast.
Wow, thank you. That was quite the intro. Appreciate you having me through. So this is cool.
Incredible. So Andre, usually what I like to do when I just start any of these episodes, I think it's always fun to just trace back the roots to where somebody started and what their kind of first interactions with music were. And so based on some of the digging that I did with either some of your DJ Mag interviews as well as other magazines, I actually discovered that you had like a bit of a musical background with some other musical projects and things like rap, death metal, post-rock. And I want to go right to the start. Where did your first connection with music come from?
Well, I come from a pretty musical family. My dad plays guitar. He was a percussionist as well. My stepdad played saxophone and was a percussionist as well. So a lot of rhythms growing up. Just a lot of music. I'd say I lived in the Bay Area of California until I was about 10 years old, and then relocated to Baltimore. And it was there that I really started to hear breakbeats. Probably my early teen years, Baltimore Club was on the radio. And that was really where I started to hear breakbeats being used in really unique ways, like, throwing an R&B song over a breakbeat or vice versa, however you want to look at it. And that just really kind of changed my understanding of time, with rhythms and that sort of thing. So I started to kind of look at, tempos and speeds differently just from that style of music. But growing up, I mean, as a kid of the 80s, I always, we had all of these genres of music kind of evolving and becoming these hyper versions that we see now, whether it was hip hop, metal, punk, we watched all these things evolve. So I think having that narrative running in the background kind of gave us this idea that music was this futuristic thing, that it was constantly evolving and becoming something greater. And I just, I kind of felt from a young age that I was going to be a part of that, just because like rhythms and things like that came naturally to me. I think my first time on a stage, I was maybe, 9 years old with one of my dad's bands, just playing maracas and that sort of thing. And so I just like rhythms always kind of come naturally to me. And I think, having, I'd say when I was a teenager, I got really into like industrial music. And this was really before like techno was widely available for everyone to hear. And so I would go to like these industrial music parties, like kind of, you know, underage nightclub kind of things. And they would play industrial dance music, and then they would start sneaking in techno and things like that. And so from there, it was like, hey, you know, there's these nights you have to be 18 to go to, and they play this kind of music all night. And so that was where I kind of started getting more exposed to that style of music and learning who local DJs were. They would be house DJs and that sort of thing. But I think it was probably around 1992, maybe. I'm kind of dating myself now, but I started to hear, you know, like these really sped up break beats, you know, like kind of hardcore breakbeat, early jungle stuff, that some of the DJs would play at, you know, these nights. And I was like, that's what's up, you know, because I really liked like extreme music. And I'm like, that's what's up.
Did you have like a particular track or something that you heard that you still remember to this day?
Maybe like Sons of a Loop-de-Loop era, something like, you know, some old stuff like that. And that was kind of like the way in for me. And, you know, just so I just get these tapes and I just listen to them over and over. And eventually I found myself, you know, playing like Jimi Hendrix records on 45 just to hear, you know, the sped up drums and that sort of thing. And it was, you know, I guess by 1995, yeah, it was when I started DJing. I had a friend that had some belt-driven linear techs, and you know, he was high enough to let me play the same 3 records over and over and over and over. And it was brutal. And still to this day, they joke about me playing some of these songs, and just, you know, I think one of them was Goldie's Inner City Life. So they had to hear every version of that song over and over and over. And to this day, I can't listen to that song now. I'm not going to lie. Like, you know, great track, but I just, it's something I can't really listen to anymore these days. But from there, you know, that's where it really kind of took off. There weren't a lot of people playing jungle in Baltimore at the time. And so I would get booked for these after hours and things like that. And I wasn't really that good, but I had the tunes. So, you know, I would get booked. And I guess the rest just kind of came from there. Had my first, you know, attempts at production in probably 1998. And it was really bad. I had, all of my friends would have like one piece of gear, or had a friend that had a couple pieces of gear. So they'd all bring them over to my house, and we set them all up and just try to make stuff that sounded like other things. And a lot of it sounded pretty bad, but, you know, we were still excited to be doing it. You know, we were doing it. And so, you know, we went through the motions. We went and got dub plates cut. It was a status thing, you know, like they sounded horrible. Like I won't listen to them now. Like I'm afraid of them.
They're in a closet somewhere, and you're like,
no, they're right over there, actually. But no, I just don't touch them. You know, they look cool on the shelf, but yeah, I don't.
Was it still under that alias that you use today, or was it a different alias?
No, the name I used back then was Delphonic.
Delphonic, okay.
Kind of like the old band, but it was spelled. Phonic was Phonik, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So when you first started getting into that DJing, though, I mean, you said that so it was the fact that you've heard a little bit of this jungle coming in through the rave scene, and this would have been in Baltimore, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, I guess you got those belt-driven turntables, and then was there a kind of connection or a spark or something like that? Where it's just like, this is kind of something I really want to do, or were you maybe more drawn to the production side?
Well, so I've been in like a series of really like crappy bands as a teenager, and you know, one thing that I've always found with bands is that everyone kind of has different motivations. They all want to do it for different reasons, and at the end of the day, I just wanted to be able to play a song. So once I found out that like DJing was, you know, something I can do that was still musical and that I could be creative with, I was like, that's the way to go, you know, because I don't have to deal with 3 or 4 other attitudes to try to play a song. I can just play an hour's worth of songs by myself. And I think that was the appeal. I think the production side of it was just like something that I knew I would eventually head towards. I don't think it was something that I really envisioned right off the bat. I just wanted to be able to mix, right? So,
Yeah. I mean,
the production became inevitably.
Sometimes even for a lot of DJs, like I think you don't really, I mean, I always go back to this dichotomy between DJ versus producer, right? And I think historically that delineation was very clear, right? It was like a DJ, you put the records on the turntable, right? The producer was like you were in the studio. But even in more recent times, like that line has become more fuzzy. And it seems like there's a lot of cross breeding between the two, right? You start off as a DJ, you become a producer, you start off as a producer, you become a DJ. But it's always interesting to see what somebody what their affinity to one or the other is, right? So I would say I produce some of my own stuff, but I don't actually, I gravitate more towards the DJing side. Do you have a particular side of the fence that you feel like you gravitate more towards?
It's weird. I kind of think, they're kind of, they kind of go hand in hand. But for me, DJing is very different than production because, when we're producing, we're making tracks, we're making songs. But I feel like when I mix, I like to do long blends, like really long blends. And so I feel like that's a new song in itself. You know what I mean? So I think with production, we're making, I don't know, what's the best analogy I can use for this?
Net new sounds.
We're just like making, like if I'm going to be layering music, I'm basically making a layer, right? Yeah. Not necessarily a song. If the song is going to be 2 tracks together making a new song, by itself, it might seem a little flimsy or minimal or not a lot happening, but I think that's intentional at the end of the day if we're going to be playing them together. So I think with my production, I try to keep DJing in mind the entire time, that way I can like keep use of space in mind and things like that. So I'm not making these really busy tracks with the intention of doing a 6-minute blend. You know what I mean? So
yeah, no, I think that's a really fascinating, even to just think about going back to that point you made right at the start of this conversation, which I thought was fascinating, the concept that music is something that is evolving, right? Which I mean, I don't know how or where that concept came from, but I do think it captures a kind of like macro philosophy or zeitgeist, right? That there's like, the music is going somewhere, man. And so even when you think about the aspect of like keeping all these extraneous factors related to music production and music creation, like I think of a very concrete example is streaming, for example. Like a lot of producers now, when they're producing music, they think, oh, am I producing this to be optimally in the format of streaming, right? So there's certain elements of the streaming ecosystem where you only get paid if I think it's like past 30 seconds or something, and then there's no value added if you stream 10 minutes versus 3 minutes. So a lot of producers tend to start editing and chopping their tracks down. And I think I was reading about this in one of those like mixing books by Bobby Owinski, one of like the mixing engineers, and he was talking about how this has all changed the way that arrangement is done. So it's interesting that then you mentioned the DJing side, and you're right, because I think if you come from a DJing background and then you start trying to do your like production, you're like, oh yeah, like, but I'm going to need 16 or 32 bar like beats before in order to beat mix in. But you also mentioned this aspect of space, which I think is something that's very unique about your sound, right? There's lots of these kind of like moments of like, how do you describe it? Like emptiness that sort of the mind fills with a sense of, I don't even know, curiosity, like intrigue. Like where did that come from for you? And how do you think about it in your productions?
I guess some of it would come from like I guess visual sensation. Like, if you were watching a movie, things like that, where you're creating suspense essentially, but instead of doing it visually, it's more auditory. I don't know if that's a good.
No, that's a really great analogy, actually.
Yeah. And I think a lot of times too, like tonally, when we have sounds clashing together, it's creating distortion and just kind of extra noise. And I think
Mhm.
that in itself becomes part of the song just as much as feedback, guitar feedback, or guitar
Mhm.
distortion. Like creates these other tones within a song that make that unique, right? Like you listen
Mhm.
to Sonic Youth, or I mean, countless bands that use dissonance, and that becomes such an essential part of their what they're doing.
Mhm.
So I think that's kind of like something that I try to do. But again, we're making formulaic music, so it's very limited to how far we can go before we're listening to just noise, right? So
Mhm.
or I guess with this particular style of music, we're trying to figure out how to make dance music weird but still like palatable, right?
Mhm.
So I think that's the intention, for me.
Yeah,
That's the
something on
goal.
like the cusp. And I think even just thinking about my own explorations in music, going back to like you consume kind of the same record over and over again, and really as a DJ, that's what you're doing. I mean, you're listening
Right.
to these tracks, you listen, and it's sort of I think I always think of it as kind of like a neuroanatomy perspective, where you're sort of just like grooving that neural pathway like way too many times,
Right.
and then you lose that novelty. And so it's interesting because then I feel like the longer you DJ, the more you have to like just keep exploring and going
Hmm.
and finding out there stuff. And like I would describe when I first came across your music, I think I was listening to a gentleman from Thailand. He's a curator. His name is First Person on YouTube. Great person to check out for anybody listening to
Okay.
this. And he did I think it was like a left field techno series, and he included a couple of your tracks, like left field techno and left field drum and bass and stuff. And I was like listening to it, like, whoa, this is. And I liked it because it kind of gave me a little bit of anxiety while I was versing.
Right. Yeah.
I was like, I have to finish this. So, but going back to that point, when you're about the space, when you're making your tracks, like, is that kind of like a terra forma, like a gravitational element that you're constantly coming back to when you're producing? Like, you're like, okay, how do I create a suspense moment here visually, but with the audio? Or is there kind of, I guess, a pillar content that you use to approach all your music with?
I think one thing that I find that I do, and I've just noticed this more so recently, is that I will make something really busy with different, combinations of percussive elements that I like. And then I'll just, once I feel like there's more than enough being said, I'll go back and remove a lot of it and only keep the stuff that's already pronounced. You know what I mean? So it's like I'm
Hmm.
making a big mess and then cleaning it up, and just the stuff that needs to stay will stay. I guess
Hmm.
that's the best way to describe it.
Yeah.
And then in doing that, it creates space, you know, um, especially for if you're playing two things together. That's another really important thing that I do is as I'm working on stuff, I will, keep exporting it and then trying it out with other music to
Hmm.
see, maybe what frequencies are lacking, or, should I put something in this frequency range so that it fills out when it's playing by itself, if it plays by itself. Because I have some things that I've made that never play by themselves. It's always with something else, unless it's a breakdown. You know what I mean?
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, yeah, so that's probably my best approach.
But even on the what you mentioned too around the formulaic nature of
Right.
of dance music, is there any experimentation you do outside of the formulas of maybe potentially stuff you don't release? Like, is that a area that you go to, you explore?
Yeah. Let's see. I had this project that I did a couple of years ago. I went back to school and I was like working with a bunch of different synths and that sort of thing. So I did this project using a vintage Buchla and a couple pieces of Eurorack gear, and made this stuff. I call it Squall, SKWOL. But it's basically music that's off the grid. Um, it's very intense. It's not clocked or anything. It's it's completely wild. I'll send it to you so you can check it out.
Sure.
I don't really know how to describe it, but it's just kind of like noisy, bass heavy synth music, I guess. I don't know. But yeah, I think doing stuff like that gives me balance for returning to, the confines of the formulaic stuff that we're doing.
And even as a personality, you've mentioned that you gravitate towards the extreme sides of music. Like, you mentioned like you had been in these bands, these post rock, death metal. What do you think about those extremes draws you as an artist so much?
That's a good question. I guess the idea of, pushing limitations, seeing how far things can go before they're not what they were, I guess, because that we see that a lot in different styles of music where, I guess a good example would be a band like the Deftones, right? They started out a certain way, but now you listen to them and you wonder, is that the Smashing Pumpkins? Like, it's kind of like a whole, where it's not really what it was, but it's still a good thing, but it's just not what it was. So I think that's what I like about extreme music, because again, referring to the Deftones, they went from something pretty heavy to something pretty soft. And that's a pretty dramatic style, or I don't want to say style change. I'll just say growth. I would say it's dramatic growth, but it definitely appeases both sides of, the auditory spectrum in that way, from going soft to very heavy. And I think that's what I like about extreme music, is that something can be really really soft and sad. That's still extreme to me. Like, if you were listening to like, let's say like Cigarettes and Sex, I think they're called, or like even something like Radiohead or something like that, that's intentionally somber. That's extreme, because it's just because it's not, to the point of putting your hands over your ears. I think it still can be extreme in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, there can also be an extremeness in the. I mostly relate, I guess, to classical music in a lot of ways, right? And just the ability to articulate a point or an emotion, but to be able to say it with enough gentleness that it doesn't fall into that extreme. Like, it's almost like it's like looking at nature, like the dew drop off of a tree on nature or something like that. It's not coerced or anything like that. It's just falling at its own pace. Or that's sort of what I draw from that analogy that you mentioned.
Okay, right.
So with that in mind, the extremeness, right? There is also this other aspect of music, which is the commercial side of music. And you having started, I think, 2 labels at this point. So there was Weaponry, which was 2017, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And then you sunset that a couple of years ago. And then you started Armory Recordings a few years after that. Is that right?
Armory is actually Red Army's. That's his label. But I've worked with him a lot over the years. And so I can see where, that would kind of seem like it could be. But yeah, it's Red Army's thing. He's been crushing it with that for a couple of years now. But yeah, so my thing was with Weaponry was, the pandemic kind of came, and that kind of like, I don't know. I think for me, it was like, okay, this is probably the end of a lot of things. We're going to see things change, which we did. We saw some pretty dramatic changes with the rise of streaming and all of that kind of stuff. And so for me, I didn't really see, well, I don't want to say I didn't see, but I think it created a lot of time for introspection, like, why are we doing what we're doing? What's the point? Right. What
existential.
Right. Yeah. Like, why are we releasing music in this way? And, but I think, in that same time, I had realized that weaponry, the label in itself, was kind of so closely tied to other things that I was doing, like with Samurai and things like that, that I knew that at some point it wasn't going to be able to reflect the growth that I foresaw after my second album, Gravity, in 2019. It's kind of like, okay, I can't just keep going through the same hoops and making the same album, making the same songs over and over just to keep something else afloat. Much less to have this other label, that I'm doing on my own, where I'm basically doing the same thing. So it just kind of seemed like the right thing to do, that, Weaponry reflected a certain point in time, certain sound that I'm not really sure is something that reflects where I'm at now. And so the plan now is, Homemade Weapons is the name, is actually going to become a label. And I'm set to start releasing stuff in 2025 with that label, Homemade Weapons. And I have a whole crew of people that will be releasing with it as well. Some of which came from the Disarm compilation series that was released this year. So a lot of those names will be popping up again. But yeah, the cool thing about Homemade Weapons will be that it'll kind of be all over the place. I don't want to say all over the place like it's loose, but in the sense that, that extreme handle, like it may be something soft and then the next release might not be as soft, So it's just more staying in control of my own narrative. Is something that I think is important, especially when it comes to art, and the way that art is kind of seen nowadays. It's important to stay in control of that narrative. So.
Can you go talk a little bit more about that with regard to how art is seen?
Well, I hate to always go back to social media, but I think that it kind of goes hand in hand with what we were talking about a little earlier, with the way things are always so hyper edited and perfect and curated. So it's, I kind of feel like, especially with the rise of artificial intelligence, it's kind of like we're taking the humanity out of art. The stuff that we're only seeing on social media is always like a finished, perfect product. We're not really seeing the processes as much. So I kind of feel like that's it in a nutshell. Art isn't as human as it once was. I think you mentioned something about this in one of your podcasts about DJ mixes they're not as human anymore.
It's the quantization and the perfection of the phrasing.
Right.
Actually, it was a gentleman I listened to, and he was on YouTube. He's been doing DJ content on YouTube for a little while. I think Elliskins is his name. And he made that point, and it was interesting because I did think about that, and then I went back and I was like, why is it that I predominantly listen to a lot of 90s essential mixes or 2000s essential mixes? I was like, oh, they did it on vinyl. They didn't have the perfect, I mean, you knew your tracks, right? But sometimes it wasn't perfect. You just had to chuck it in.
Right. Yeah, totally. I don't miss that at all either. I haven't played vinyl in years. I'm guilty of using record box if that's a crime. But I do think that it gives me more time to focus on selection and actual mixing, as opposed to spending a minute beat matching and doing all of that.
For me, it's more. I have to rewind it like 9 times because I started as a digital DJ.
Oh, okay, right, yeah. So I don't miss it.
Yeah. I think it's partially just different mediums, right? Like and they reveal, going back to that evolution, right? Of even the code development between technology and humanity. There's this point I talk about in one of the courses. I think it's from like can't remember the title of the book, but it's like, it's about techno. It's a quote about that it's used often in techno, but it's like to technify the world is to technify oneself is to realize like the unification of man and machine and the co-evolution or something like that. I'm like, whoa.
Yeah, it's heavy. That's deep.
Right? But it also creates some interesting questions about what is the, like, I'm not saying necessarily what's the purpose of art, but I guess there is a human element to art, right? There is something about the human experience that we try to make manifest in artistic, perhaps not logical pieces. If you look at, like, I guess, modern art and abstract art and things like that. And I wrote an essay a while ago about basically like the development of intelligence. It's called like the return on intelligence problem. Sort of like outlines this quote I read from a gentleman saying like the economy has been set up in a way that has kind of like the potential to make humans irrelevant just based on the allocation of capital towards higher automation and these kinds of things. And I think one of the challenges we have with looking at like a transhumanism event or something like that is that we don't know what it means from a human condition perspective, right? It's just unknown. And for that reason, it's scary. But I think on the other side of the equation, I guess, if you look at the development of music, electronic music, for example, like it has been birthed by essentially technology, right? Like the fact that we don't have bands anymore and that we're using drum samples and hi-hats and snares. So maybe it's a point in time kind of thing too, to just see like, okay, here's where things are going, or here's where things were when I started, and here's where things are going. And it's like a differential between the two. Do you have any particular like physical instruments or anything that you still play?
I do. I play bass still sometimes. I have like some, every now and then I'll record things and just make weird little rock songs or whatever, just for fun. I still find inspiration in playing instruments, because I think that that's something that we don't really hear naturally in electronic music. And even when we do hear instrumentation, it's always so polished, right? It doesn't really sound like somebody's just jamming on a guitar. It sounds like maybe a computer played the guitar even,
Yeah.
So I guess it's a matter of, on a much bigger scale, what is art at this point, right? What is it? What is it anymore? And that we could probably spend hours talking about that, honestly. So.
I had a friend of mine. She's just like absolutely brilliant. She, I think, was studying theory and criticism, a PhD in theory and criticism, and we got into a discussion actually about what this question of art. And she mentioned that the concept of art as a self-expression is actually quite a new idea, right? Historically, when you look at the times, ancient times, like you had the muse, right? You would call upon the muse in order to inspire you. So it wasn't that you were expressing your own sense of individuality manifest in the world. It was a channeling of the divine through the human. And I was like, whoa, that's an interesting, it's almost like you saw the world as red for so long, and then all of a sudden you realize it was blue at one point. And it's, I think, under those different presumptions, perhaps there's different ways that music and art gets created, right? If you think it's a manifest divine or concretized divine, that probably produces a different product, if you could call it that, in the end, versus when you view it as self-expression.
Right. Yeah. I guess when you think about it, would you say the self-expression thing is more of a 20th century kind of thing, or would you say, what I mean? Would you say it's something that's become more common in the past 100 years, or do you think it's like more recent that this is
I think it's been amplified, I suppose, in more recent times. And there's probably a few reasons for that, even as it relates to DJing, for example. And we talked about this at one point, like idea of sort of egalitarian versus elevation, right?
Right.
It's even manifest at the level of the design of a club now, that there's
Sure.
one performer who is expressing themselves upon
Right.
the stage, and we are but, part of the audience, versus my understanding of if you were at like a 90s basement or something like that, it was probably just like a pop-up table, right? On the floor.
Yeah.
And there was an egalitarianness to it.
That's kind of what I think is really missing. I think we're really missing that now. I'm not really a big fan of the idea of a DJ being on this high pedestal above everyone. I think that kind of supports the kind of like this whole. I think one of the problems with where we are now is this individualized sense of, just like the way DJs are now, artists in general, just the way they promote themselves. It's less about the movement or the community and just more about the artist. And I feel like, in a way, I kind of blame American EDM for that, because that, that's where that all kind of came from. Because like you're even referring to, DJs being closer to the floor and that sort of thing, and versus now, you have these giant stage platforms with all these lasers and visuals and all of this stuff, and it's more like a rave concert at that point. It's not really like a community gathering where people are embracing underground sounds. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I think it's even at the level of some of the festivals and events that I've gone to. I mean, there's different, obviously different sounds, and then there's different productions for each type of event, right? So something like an Electric Daisy Carnival is, like you mentioned. I mean, I've never been, but I've seen photos, and it's really, like, it's really just wow, a lot of stuff. And I think there is something to the concept of scale. I think it was a gentleman named Nassim Taleb. He wrote in a book called The Black Swan, maybe. But he talks about this concept of scale and ensembles. And so a group of 10 people, for example, is not the same thing as a group of 100 people just multiplied by 10. Right? There's actual different properties to those groups, right? And even if you think about it from like, hey, you're playing back when you first got to doing your DJing with like a couple of your friends, right? You're just playing Goldie's Inner City Records like over and over.
Right. Yeah.
Versus if you had like 100 people in a bar, you would have those different personalities, or even like a band, right? 2 people just playing instruments versus the 4 or so personalities that you were dealing with when you were in your bands as a teenager. So I think scale changes things, and particularly with relation to the festivals and that kind of thing. And I do think also the sound can attract a particular type of community.
Right.
And then what you do see is people are really released to be free, honestly, like when they're in that kind of container where they're able to just like express who they are.
Right.
And so I think it's challenging, because on one side you have the commercial viability perspective, and I do think now with so much availability and connectivity, there's almost like that stimulus that you need to reach higher and higher levels of euphoria.
Right.
And maybe that's because we don't realize that we just like want to belong, right? So it's that individualist kind of perspective. What do you think about that?
Well, for me, having played larger events and smaller events, I find that at some of the larger events, especially when they're really over the top big, I don't know if people are really listening to the music. I think that it becomes more of a passive listening experience because there's too much going on, right? And so there's this goal to be playing those events, but then there's also this goal to be playing the club events. But the problem with the club events is that post-pandemic, we're looking at clubs that just want to be able to open their doors tomorrow. So they're going to take the music that isn't necessarily made for smaller groups, and just so that they can fill their bars and get
Hmm.
people drinking, and so it's more party type music. So we have this kind of void now where I would say, like, different styles of music aren't available to people.
Hmm.
And so you're basically stuck with, you know, venues making money, whatever that music is, which is typically party music, more mainstream sounding music, or you have these big festivals where no one's really listening, and it's
Hmm.
also pretty much the same type of party music. Does that make
Hmm.
sense? So we have this whole void of all of these different styles of music expression that's being missed out on because of making money. Really, is
Hmm.
what it boils down to. Um,
I guess the other side of it, though, is that there's always been mainstream appeal music, right?
or
But with certain developments in technology, like we do have alternative venues, right? Maybe
right,
not physically speaking, but
right,
virtually speaking, that allow that sense of expression or music or sound to come up. Like I think of, I've just been listening to a lot of liquid drum and bass recently,
sure,
and just like Caliber, and I looked at his set at like Liquidity in 2016, and
right,
there was like a decent number of people, but I feel as though a lot of people who probably listen to liquid drum and bass are not necessarily like, it's going to be kind of like you're just chilling at home or like working or something like that.
right.
And I guess you have those alternative venues that give you that sense of expression.
Yeah, but I don't know if it really satisfies the. It's if you're
Mm,
listening virtually, you're not really having a communal experience. Like, there's
yeah.
chats and there's all of these things, but at the end of the day, physically assembling, we saw what not having that did to us as
Hmm.
people, right? It created more division amongst people. It made us more afraid of each other. Um, and now it's, when it comes down to physical assembly, it's based on these things that are essentially money based, right?
Hmm.
It's made around. It's not just assembling, and listening to music. There has to be some kind of consumption, or spending, or something happening, as opposed to it just being people gathering and playing music.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think, I mean, it's fascinating to see living in like a major city here in Toronto, like how different types of micro cultures and micro genres try to organize and create those types of
Right.
stimulus or events. Like I've been to a bunch of events fall from like 7 people in a basement to
Sure, sure.
you know to
Those are some of
larger
the
things.
best, though. Those are some of the best.
Yeah.
Playing for smaller, intimate crowds. You have people that are fully engaged, or they're there. They have an agenda, right?
Hmm.
Like, if you play a venue and there's 20 people there and you don't know them,
Hmm.
they're there, you know, for various reasons, but usually it's because they want to hear you play.
Hmm.
Versus, again, playing some big event where people don't even know if you played because they were running around with their friends, or
Hmm.
things like that. And that's where it's kind of almost a catch-22 in that sense. Like, it's cool to be
Yeah.
playing these big events and to say, yeah, I played it and I was there, but at the end of the day, it's not the same experience that you had with the 20 people that were shouting and you know enjoying themselves and screaming at you and stuff like that. That's what I like. That's
Mm.
fun. That means, like, you're doing something right.
Hmm.
Versus, okay, I'm playing this event, so that means I'm doing something right.
Yeah.
Two different things. One's like an entitlement, one is actually an experience. you know
Hmm.
so
How do you feel, I guess, about the drum and bass culture as it relates to that then? Because I think drum and bass is a bit more of an I mean, it's not fair to say it's an underdog genre,
right,
but it maybe doesn't. I mean, the pace, for example, doesn't necessarily cater to everybody's taste. I mean, I have a collection of tons of amazing, like, just chill, soulful, or even look at samba bass, like samba and bass, like those tracks you play in the park is just incredible. But it's the
right.
pace of drum and bass that makes it kind of pushes a lot of people away. How do you feel about the culture as it relates to that? I guess big festival versus small probably caters a little bit more to the intimate side.
Yeah, as far as what I do, I prefer that. But again, you have like the party stuff, the jump up, and
Hmm.
you know, there's music that's made with that specific intention, right? Versus like,
Hmm.
oh, I'm gonna do something really complex that's gonna make them stop and stroke their beards or hold their arms. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, that's still a response, right?
Hmm.
It's still a way of engaging with people on an emotional level because you're making them think as opposed to just wildly move around. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but I think it's good to be able to touch people in different ways than rather them having an expectation and you just, giving them what they want.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, that's the authenticity side, right? Of
yeah,
remaining as like as a DJ and an artist, right? That's where you draw that fine line. We talk about it so much on this podcast about the maintaining that authenticity. Like, you have things that you want to play. Like I very selfishly look at DJing as like I think there's a sort of duty that you have in order to be exploring and like presenting things to folks
right,
that maybe not necessarily they haven't heard yet. Part of that is the explorer side of DJing, right? It's being on that perimeter and that edge of like what is currently happening.
right,
But then you also have that side where it's like, hey, you're playing a party, right? And people are showing up because they want to. Like, I love to dance, right? So I'm like, I want to be in there and I want to dance. But it is interesting. I think, for example, of like alternative formats of dance. One of which I is like ecstatic dance, and this is a new style of kind of party or event that has been growing a little bit more, at least to my knowledge,
right.
where it's usually like alcohol free, but you have like a cacao ceremony or something like that before, so people will drink basically just like hot chocolate essentially,
Right, right. Wow.
and then you sort of you dance, and it's a free form dance. I think of it kind of like a dancing meditation,
Okay.
and it's a wildly human and beautiful experience
Huh.
because people are not really paying attention to what other people are doing, and you're just sort of moving with the music and doing what you want. And I think in those sets that I've experienced with ecstatic dance, you do get a little bit more of a variety of different experimental things, right? Like violins or ambient music. And
Right.
it's less about the predictability of the next drop, but more about the kind of flow and freedom. So maybe experimenting with these alternative formats of dance will kind of, I don't know, maybe catalyze some of these more intimate experiences where people are really experiencing.
I could see something like that. I could totally see something like that. Especially if you're working in like different time signatures and just making stuff that's really not accessible,
Mm.
to your common 4/4 experience. So yeah, it'd be really great if those if that became more of a thing. I would like to see that without a doubt.
Yeah, yeah. Even thinking about time signatures as like different universes, right? Of I guess dance or even music, because we are so, and I love it. Like I'm a house guy, so I love
Right.
my four kick drums and my claps. But even just getting outside of that and just being like, oh, this is different, or how do I move my body to this, right? Or
Right.
how do I DJ to this is another question, right?
Right.
And that creates additional challenge.
I guess, expressive dance forms could be, you know, maybe that is something new that hasn't really been touched on. Whereas, we have the typical format of the club with the DJ, everyone just goes and dances to one style of music and leaves
Mhm.
versus, but I do see a fair amount of, I would say, non-conventional dancing.
Yeah.
I do see a fair amount of that in the clubs, when I played. And so I don't know, maybe that's kind of already happening. And,
Mhm.
you know, so,
I think also the cultural aspect of DJing, and what I see is a lot of DJs getting very creative with like where DJing can happen, right? It doesn't necessarily
right.
need to happen at the club. Like obviously we have a lot of these destination type of like sets
Mhm.
and things that you see on YouTube, which
Right.
can be valuable and useful. But even there was the gentleman, I can't remember what his name is, but he did drum and bass on a bike. Um,
Oh, okay. Is that
yeah.
and he has the controller
Yes.
on his, yes, yes. And he's like a Beatport guy, right? I think he's a Beatport guy.
Perhaps
Does
I
it
don't
through
know.
Beatport, I think. Yeah,
Yeah.
I know who you're talking about. That guy's funny. British guy, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I've seen that guy. He's funny. Yeah.
But the thing that I loved about the concept that he had was there was a beautiful comment that I read, which is like, wow, look at this. Like everybody's getting outside, everybody's getting exercise, everybody's on a bike, right? Biking around town, just like enjoying and just having fun. And so I think seeing more of those types of experimentations is quite interesting. But then obviously you have to have the balance too, because maybe the people want to drive on the road.
There's that. Yeah. I think a big part of what makes that special as well is the social media component. Like we're allowed to be there through this person's lens and to experience it in that way. But it almost seems like, is that like a thing that people like, hey, we're going to be doing this big, ride around with a DJ? Is that like a thing? People do that regularly, or is it?
I don't know if it's done as popularly outside of that gentleman's YouTube channel, but I have seen like a few people, around Toronto, for example. Some guy retrofitted his bike and he goes around with it.
Oh wow!
Okay. Yeah, I was like,
wow,
impressed.
that's really cool. Okay, that's cool. That's a thing. Wow.
Yeah, nice. But even in my own experience, like I have kind of like my own little mobile. Like I just have a Rolly speaker and like I bring like a DDJ 400 and I've done like yoga and DJing sets together and just
wow.
Yeah, combining those two things. I mean, it is a little bit about being able to fit, and I guess this goes back to the DJing aspect, is like, which I think is I think it's going to be a growing and important skill, is like being able to fit the vibe to the venue and what you're doing, right? Drum and bass on a bike, I don't know why it works, but it does.
Yeah.
But if you're playing like a yoga event, like you probably don't necessarily want to be doing like whatever 130 kind of like party music, right? It's a different, you're more organic, down tempo, a lot more ethnic sort of influences. So
sure.
I think that sort of matching the venue with the vibe has been something that I've been thinking about, because on a previous podcast I was talking to Razak, one of the DJs, and we were saying that like a lot of DJs seem to be becoming very like linear in terms of what they can play. It's like you're a tech house DJ, you only play tech house, and maybe they play things outside of that, but it does create this this rigidity, I suppose, which maybe goes back to that whole pattern that you mentioned, where it's like, oh, you want to be playing at the big club or big festival, so this is the path.
Yeah, I kind of feel like that need to stay within those boundaries, kind of says we don't want you to stray the path. It kind of says we want to make sure that we get back whatever we invest in having your name on a flyer. I don't know. I still think that, everything is, sadly, it's so money driven. It's not really expression driven like we would like it to be. And I think that's why we're seeing that, as you say. What I'm concerned about is, like you're saying with the vibe and that sort of thing. If we're becoming really good at writing prompts, like how long is it before we're like, I'm just going to tell ChatGPT to play music that fits this aesthetic and this vibe, rather than have a human that's going to throw on something that I don't like randomly, or I'm just going to have my own curated playlist that AI mixes for me. I don't know. That's the only kind of thing that, I mean, we're seeing just more robotic replacement happening, just in, manual labor and even with artistic practices now. And so I'm concerned like where that will put us, you and I, for example, as far as what we're capable of versus, what technology has in store for the next few years. So.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of times technology has this Promethean fire quality to it, right? Where there is that, like event horizon. You're not really sure what will happen. At least with my own forays into like Spotify DJing, like I just found it was awful. I just wished it would have ended. And maybe that was part of the voice that they used. I don't know, but I guess the romantic artistic part of me wants to believe that there is that human side that will kind of always want to be there. Like, I feel like perhaps we'll get to a point where things become so curated that you do want, like, I mean, I think of this this gentleman here. I can't recall what his name was. I wrote it down, but it was John Cage. He was an abstract musicologist. I don't know if that's what you call it.
Yeah.
And he wrote a piece called 433, which is, it's an abstract piece of music that is nothing. Like, there's no, like, it instructs all of the performers to play nothing for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. And at least my understanding of what a Cage was trying to say with it was like, even parts of, like, even the non-noise parts of music can also be noise. So I was like watching this YouTube video of person's coughing and stuff like that, and you're like, oh, this is part of the music. And so
that's awesome. I love it. Yeah.
But it's sort of playing with that, and it's sometimes we want to be surprised by what we can experience. And so I think that's why, at least currently, as human beings, we're able to kind of pull in some of those surprises. So who knows, maybe given that a lot of these AI models, whether they're doing things with creation of music or curating of music, they do things stochastically, which is sort of how, like, logically we do things. But I'm not sure. I think eventually it goes back to what you said about, there is that need to physically assemble, and kind of you do want to show up for your friends who are playing and DJing at a particular event, and you want to support them because that's our way that we understand, the human condition and our experience.
Right. Yeah, I think so. I think the physical assembly part is kind of key. Like, I think streaming is great, but I think that it continues to kind of glorify this idea that DJs need attention, which is really, kind of questions the whole ethos of the DJ. Is it about the music or is it about the individual? Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess, in certain styles of music that applies. Like, if you're a hip hop DJ, of course it applies. It's definitely about the music, but it's also about the DJ in that sense. But, in other styles of music, I don't know if that necessarily should apply. I see it, kind of poaching certain attitudes from different styles and trying to bring it into a different genre or something, and it doesn't really mesh with what else might be going on, and I think that in itself is another way for people to get attention. So I don't know. I'm kind of wary of where this is headed, So
now, would you describe yourself as a DJ or a DJ and a producer who enjoys the spotlight, I suppose? Or would you maybe shy away a little bit and prefer to kind of just let your music speak?
Yeah, I'm not one to, I don't like putting myself all over the place. That's not really ever been my thing.
Yeah.
I think that having some kind of mystique to what you do leaves some imagination for the listener, for the audience to kind of fill in the blanks as they wish, versus having too much of yourself out there that it's, it doesn't. I kind of see some artists where they're so they're more influencers than artists, and they are so more stuck on the attention and that rather than the music. So the music that they might do almost doesn't really seem fitting to their personality. You know what I mean? So it's like, well, this is just kind of like my job. This is what I do to get more of your attention, more of your likes, more of your whatever it is, social currency. So I don't know.
So then from I suppose, like, from your lens then, which is more of like an authentic looking at the music and trying to push the what is the agenda, I suppose, the evolution of the music, going back to the start of this conversation, right? That's kind of how you're looking at the music that you're pushing out, the sets that you're pushing out?
Yeah, I guess in a way I'd rather go backwards, than forward on the trajectory that we're on. Just so we can have things that feel real, and like we're not just trying to do things to keep up with the quo, with what's going on. Yeah, so I guess the authenticity is a very, important part of it all.
Yeah.
And I hope we get back to a point where that's like, people will be able to see that right away versus 25,000 followers and X amount of listeners on Spotify. And it's like, versus like, okay, so me personally, I've always, like, growing up especially, if I liked an artist and they weren't well known, that was really special to me. They were like my band. You know what I mean? But the second, they became like a household word, it was like, the value changes, right? And but at the same time, like you'll see the people that, when it becomes a household name, they love it. They've got it everywhere, they love it. But the second that fades, they might not stick with it, right? And I think that that's the people that do, the people that continue to ride with it. They're the real fans. And I feel like that's the kind of stuff that I would rather be a part of. Like, I'd rather have something that is real, that has real people that are engaged in what you're doing versus people that are just liking it because other people like it, right?
Yeah.
Because it's popular. So
I think part of it, the mentality of a DJ, because I also relate to some of that sentiment as well, where on one hand, I feel like you just naturally discover things before people do, right? Because as the DJ, like, you are the filter, right? You are supposed to be listening to the tracks, picking the best, right? To then present to everybody. And so there are lots of cases where, like, I've kind of have been early on a wave or somewhere this, and I'm like, oh, this is a great sound. But then, as you mentioned, it does sort of really grow and blow up. And then it goes back to the scale, right? The scale changes things. And it's not necessarily what the artist is doing. So maybe there is like a little bit more of that rebellious side of the DJ, where it's like, oh, I want, it's either my band or it's, it's the artist that I discovered, which maybe is an ego thing. Who knows? But I do think it serves a purpose in some way, in that, like, you are motivated to continue to go out and explore. On the point around the sort of hit versus not hit, or like steady rise, I feel like it's a really challenging thing. And I don't know enough about, I guess, the economics of the music industry. My understanding is, at least if you're one of these big labels, you really do depend on these massive hits. But from a commercial viability of musicians' perspective, I think riding that wave and getting like I think Kevin Kelly was somebody who said that it's like, if you have 1,000 true fans, like, that's really all you need in order to kind of keep yourself alive and doing what it is that you want to do. But I guess there's the other side of us, the human side, that always wants to keep growing and, like, building and developing. But it's challenging, because then you sort of alienate your audience.
Yeah, you do. But I think, for every so many that you lose, your relationship with another intensifies. It becomes emboldened. And then you're also going to connect with new people, right? So, I kind of feel like bands, artists, like, they have kind of like revolving doors. People come and go. They might like your first album but hate your ninth album. I look at a band like Smashing Pumpkins for that, and I say, okay, 90s, good band, but they probably should have stopped, and now they're still going, and it's like, oh, it's painful to see. It's painful to see, but they're still selling tickets and they're still making new fans. So, more power to them.
And I think maybe that's the human side of it too, right? We get enamored by the stories, right? And part of the also motivation of this podcast is like, hey, let's see who the people behind the names are, right? And what they think, what they do. And I think that gives us a little bit more, it's so much different to hear an artist sing and then see their name on a piece of music, but then you actually go and you're like, oh, this is that person and this is what they do and this is how they live, and you sort of get a different perspective and appreciation from that lens.
Yeah, definitely.
So as we get towards the end of the episode here, I'm wondering, from your perspective, both, I guess, doing it all really, DJing these larger events, having your own pretty solid fan base, producing music, obviously connecting with all these amazing record labels. What kind of advice would you give to the people that are emerging, just coming up either as artists, producers, DJs, if you were to start today?
Well, don't get a cat. No, I'm just kidding.
I'm saying that because the cat's been bugging him the entire time.
Oh no, he's right over here, just doing his thing. He's getting impatient. But I would say something that has really occurred to me over the past few years that I'm not seeing a lot of is, I think that artists now just need to be, especially DJs, they just need to kind of be more in touch with their motivation, why they're doing what they're doing. What is the end result, right? Knowing, like, what's your purpose? Like, if it's just to be a DJ and play for 10 people, then have that be it. But, like, I feel like it's the environment is constantly changing. So people's desires are changing. And I think knowing, I want to make music and release on this label. And if that's your goal, then that should be the goal. Like I think, like, we need to be in touch with just what our intentions are and that sort of thing with music, because, we're getting pulled in all of these different ways all of the time. Whether it's for things completely unrelated to music or, what have you. So that's intention. And that's is probably the number one thing. I think the other thing too is to just kind of be careful, who you trust as well, because you're going to, especially as an artist, if you're doing something good or something fresh, you're going to have people pulling at you in different directions, trying to see you as an opportunity for themselves. So, and most importantly, register with ASCAP, BMI, one of those groups. Always copyright, trademark, own all your stuff, and stay in control of your narrative. Always have an exit route, that sort of thing. Just always stay in control of your own story, so no one, can end you or start you or whatever, So yeah, I guess that's pretty much it.
Yeah. All right, then. So for our last segment here, and I did think I prepped you with this. So 3 tracks. We're looking for Under the Radar, On Repeat, and your guilty pleasure.
Okay. So the Under the Radar actually pulled this one out. So this is one of my favorite compilations. It's vinyl too. It was like a sub label of Good Looking Records, which was like a atmospheric drum and bass label. But this Soul Food, they did a series of these Soul Food releases, and it's pretty much like down tempo acid jazz kind of stuff, but it's all of the artists from the well, not all of them, but a lot of them made this kind of down tempo jazz stuff, and the presentation of it is just really good. It's like really nice, artwork and everything. So I think that that's something that's kind of slept on, that I don't know if everybody knows about it, but I was having a conversation with one of my friends recently, and I played him one of the songs, and he's like, I've never heard of that. And I'm like, oh, wow. Yeah, you're sleeping. So you got it. The Soul Food compilation, the series, came out on Cookin' Records, is probably the Under the Radar thing for me. On Repeat, there's a band from California. It's kind of like some post-grunge shoegaze kind of stuff. It's a band called Citrus. And I found them through Spotify, and became a really big fan of their self-titled EP, enough that I eventually reached out to them and, tried to figure out some way that we could work together musically. So we'll see what happens with that. But yeah, and then I guess the guilty pleasure is, I don't know, maybe a good 10 years ago or so, there's a band called Memory Tapes. It's kind of like some indie rock kind of stuff. And they had a song called Wait in the Dark that was remixed by Jensen Sportag, which is kind of like some, I guess, funk kind of 80s sounding stuff. But it was a really good remix, like so good that it's better than the original. And it's what they've done is they completely moved the vocals around and just created a whole new piece from it. And I really like that particular song, but I like when remixes are done in that way. It's just so. But yeah, that's it. Those are my three.
Yeah, amazing. Definitely on the I mean, it was good looking, right? There's the
good looking. It's Cookin' Records, Soul Food series. It's the compilation.
Yeah. Incredible. Yeah, I love a lot of what LTJ Bookham puts out. And yeah, definitely changed my experience of drum and bass. I was like, whoa! So amazing. Well, Andre, this conversation has definitely been as introspective as your music can make one. So
thanks for having me.
Yeah, really appreciate you coming on board. And for everybody listening, make sure you subscribe on all the different podcast vendors, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and be on the lookout for Homemade Weapons coming in 2025, the label. And Andre to continue bringing us some different variants of music. So I'm Robert Simos. This has been the Beyond the Decks podcast. And Andre, thank you again for joining us for this episode.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. Appreciate it.